Credited to Carl Linnaeus, the classification of animals, or taxonomy, first became a scientific endeavour during the 18th century. However, human attempts to classify organisms date back to ancient Egypt. As stated in the previous episode, animals are multicellular eukaryotes whose cells are bound together by collagen. But how we classify animals further from that has evolved and changed over millennia. The earliest inklings of taxonomy, the practice of classification, were found in the records of ancient Egypt. In these early records, depictions of medicinal plants adorned the walls. But it wasn't until Aristotle that classification became a formal science. Aristotle at first simply divided living beings into two categories, plants and animals. Classifications were only based on observable characteristics, such as the number of legs or the presence of blood, and came up with the idea of vertebrates and invertebrates, although he didn't use this terminology. Then, in the Middle Ages, taxonomy was approached from a more philosophical view. Most people agreed on the concept of a great chain of being, which aimed to place all living beings in a hierarchical ladder. Based mainly in Christianity, God was of course at the top of the ladder, just above angelic beings. Then came humans, who were seated above all other animals, including other great apes. Right at the bottom of this chain, despite not being classified as living organisms now, were minerals. Minerals were unable to move, grow, or reproduce, and therefore had the lowest priority on this ladder. Linnaeus is probably the person most associated with taxonomy. Linnaeus created a system known as binomial nomenclature, which simplified the long Latin descriptions used to name plants at the time. This system gave every species a two-part name, the first referring to a genus or a group of similar species, and the second referring to a specific species. Then in 1735, Linnaeus published the famous Systema Naturae, introducing his new system of classification, initially in an 11-page pamphlet. Over the next 23 years and 9 editions, the publication grew to a huge 2-volume set. Somewhat shockingly for the time, Linnaeus was also the first person to classify humans alongside apes. Other early taxonomists include John Ray and Daniel Solander. John Ray was slightly before Linnaeus' time, working on classifying plants within his Historia Plantarum, and was the first to attempt a true biological definition for a species. One of his classification rules is still used today, and that is his split of plants into those that have 2 seedling leaves, known as dicotyledons, and those with only 1, also known as monocotyledons. Solander, born in 1733, was somewhat of a prodigy of Linnaeus. He spent a lot of time aboard the HMS Endeavour, travelling the world, collecting and classifying thousands of plant and animal specimens. However, Solander initially went to university to study law, before being inspired by a botany professor called Carl Linnaeus. In 1759, at the age of 26, Linnaeus sent a young Solander to England. Solander had every intention of returning to Sweden to complete his doctorate, but he never returned, being appointed as assistant librarian of the British Museum in 1762. Despite briefly leaving to travel on the HMS Endeavour, Solander returned to the British Museum as assistant keeper and remained here working with the collections until he died in 1782. However, despite all this work being done in the early 18th century, the word taxonomy was not coined until 1813 by Swedish botanist A.P. de Condol. The word was rooted in Greek, with taxis meaning arrangement and nomia meaning method. Traditionally, there are 3 domains of life: eukarya, which includes the animals and plants, bacteria and archaea. However, recent studies suggest that eukarya may have descended from archaea and therefore there would be only 2 domains. The current scale of classification goes as follows: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Understandably, this can be quite difficult to remember, so many people have created mnemonics to remember them. One of these is distinguished king penguins can't offer free gymnastic sessions. Beneath domain, the next highest level of classification is phylum. Depending on your source, there are between 34 and 36 accepted phyla, including everything from mollusks to annelids, and from echinoderms to chordates. Typically, phyla are separated by their overall body plan. Next are the classes, of which there are around 107 for animals. All animals within a class share certain attributes. For example, all mammals feed their young on milk produced by mammary glands. Then are the orders within the classes. There are around 26 for mammals, between 23 and 27 for birds, 4 for reptiles, and 3 for amphibians. Orders are groups of related families whose members share certain characteristics due to their shared ancestry. When classification becomes more complex, scientists may further divide families and genera within an order into suborders or other such ranks. Then, within each order, such as the Artiodactyla, are several families. For example, Cervidae, which are also known as the deer. Each of these families contains genera. Sometimes just a single genus can make up an entire family, as is the case for the Antilocapridae, which contains only the pronghorn. One of the lowest classifications is species. There are estimated to be around 7.8 million living animal species, but the exact definition of a species has long been disputed. The most widely used definition is any group of organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring, but there are exceptions to this rule. There can be lower ranks in a species, for example, subspecies. Subspecies often represent distinct populations of a species that, despite their differences, can still breed with other populations of the same species. In the modern day, the use of binomial nomenclature is very important. Usually the name is written in italics, but when handwritten it is often accepted for the name to be underlined. The genus name must always start with a capital letter, but the species part must always start with a lowercase letter. These names are vital as they allow scientists to accurately identify various species around the world without needing to know hundreds of languages and dialects, especially as several species may have the same common name in different areas of the world. For example, when I say robin, the bird you immediately picture heavily depends on whether you live in the UK or the US.